So I'll just start with the question, what is philosophy? Which is quite a difficult question to answer. But often people think of philosophy as exploring and trying to provide answers to deep fundamental questions. So questions like, what is the nature of ourselves and the universe? What are the limits of human knowledge? And asking questions about morality and the meaning of life. But also philosophy as a field is often broadly concerned with providing arguments. And these arguments are typically primarily conceptual or intellectual rather than primarily about empirical matters, but they often do engage with empirical research as well. And of course, philosophy isn't just restricted to what goes on in philosophy departments. People inside and outside academia do philosophical thinking all the time. So what is a philosophy of science specifically? I'm a philosopher of science. I thought it'd be helpful to just briefly clarify what this means. So it can refer to a variety of things. Some philosophers of science ask fundamental questions about science, like what is science? What separates science from pseudoscience? Is there a single scientific method? Does scientific progress exist? How does scientific theory change occur? What is scientific representation, etc., etc. Some of us ask more narrow conceptual questions. So not necessarily these really broad general questions, but narrow questions within a particular scientific field. And this is more the kind of work that I do. Here's some examples. So in philosophy of biology, you might ask, what is an organism or a biological individual? Can evolutionary theory be generalized? In philosophy of medicine, we might ask questions like, what is health and what is disease? What is the role of diagnosis? What is disability? How do we compare or integrate or rank different forms of evidence? And in philosophy of social science, we might ask questions like, do social sciences establish laws? And is there a scientific method in social science? And also philosophers of science might be engaged in thinking about questions of causation, explanation, inference, methodology, the processes of knowledge production, and the role of values. And of course, political or ethical questions like what experiments or interventions are morally permissible, or how might research funding be distributed. And in philosophy of science, and particularly these kind of specialized fields like philosophy of biology or medicine or physics or what have you, often draw quite heavily on empirical research, and philosophers in these fields might see their work as being quite continuous with the sciences and often have the aim of influencing and informing scientific practice. So I thought it might be interesting just to briefly mention a couple examples of the things that I've worked on for the past couple of years. I would situate myself as a philosopher of biology and medicine primarily. So my PhD thesis was looking at cultural evolution. That's an area of science where people try to apply evolutionary models or evolutionary thinking to culture. And this is just an example of a book chapter that I wrote for a recent edited collection called Global Epistemologies and Philosophies of Science. And in that, I was arguing that the work that goes on in cultural evolution reveals a commitment to a particular epistemology. In particular, these models and theories prioritize generalizability as a key epistemic value. And sometimes that comes into tension with other values and other epistemologies. And the postdoc that I was working on in Germany that Sonia mentioned was looking at how social categories, including race and fatness, are constructed and deployed in post-genomic science like epigenetics or microbiome research. And I won't say much more about this now, but if anybody is curious to know more about what I'm working on, you could ask me a question or pop me an email. Okay, so I thought it might be helpful just to introduce a couple philosophical terms that some or maybe most of you might be already familiar with. So often people talk about this distinction between ontology and epistemology. And ontology roughly is the study of what there is. So what exists, what is the stuff that reality is made out of, what are the features and relations of these things in a very general sense. So for example, is it things, is it entities that make up reality, or is it processes? That's a debate that's going on in philosophy right now. And in contrast, epistemology is concerned with knowledge. So questions like what is knowledge, what counts as knowledge, how knowledge claims are justified, and how we should think about explanation. And there's clearly some kind of relationship between ontology and epistemology. So for example, you might have an ontology which presupposes regularity or uniformity in nature. And then your epistemology, so the way you approach knowledge and scientific inquiry, might then place emphasis on discovering these regularities. Or you might allow for multiple ontologies. You might think that different perspectives are not just picking up on different aspects of the same reality, but there really are different realities that are created by the worldview and experiences of different individuals. And that would mean, for example, that our epistemologies are plural and context dependent. And here's a diagram that I think is a little bit simplistic, but this is roughly how it's often thought about or depicted. So you have these philosophical foundations of research. Here we have ontology and epistemology. There's also axiology there, which is values and ethics and morality. And then sort of building on that, you have theory, methodology, and method. And it's often thought that ontology constrains epistemology, which constrains methodology and constrains methods, or shapes or guides them in some way. I will say that in my personal opinion, ontology often matters a little bit less than sometimes people take it to, but maybe that's a idiosyncratic view. If you're committed to a particular ontology, as I mentioned, that's obviously going to constrain you and guide you towards particular epistemologies, but it is possible to be agnostic about ontology and still develop fruitful epistemologies and epistemic practices. So in the time I have left, I just wanted to briefly give a sense of some ways in which philosophy and the work of philosophers can impact scientific or social scientific research. There's a lot of ways in which philosophy is taken up within empirical research. Maybe some of you have heard or will hear a little bit about the grouping of philosophical thought into schools like positivist, post-positivist, realist, and so on, and the different orientations this might have towards ontology and epistemology. There's a lot of things that could be said about what those schools refer to and the varying commitments of the people who are taken to fall under these labels. There's a lot of nuances there. So, and I guess we'll hear a bit more about realism in a minute. So I just wanted to kind of leave that aside for now, but I'll be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I wanted to just give a couple examples of more contemporary philosophy of science that relates to qualitative health research. And just to say, my work is within the analytic tradition, which is a mainly Anglo-American tradition of philosophy. So that's what I'm going to be pointing to, but there's a lot more out there. So I said I would set some of these schools aside, but just to say that one thing that's often attributed to so-called positivist authors is a deductive relationship between evidence and hypothesis. So the idea is that if you have an observation or a set of observations, that constitutes evidence, which you can then read off your hypothesis from. There's a straightforward logical relationship. And the work of Helen Longino has in part demonstrated that this just isn't the case. So I won't go into the specifics of her argument, but the central claims are things like state of affairs do not stand in unique evidential relations with hypotheses, and there's not a uniquely correct description for each object of description. So she identifies this gap between theory and data, and she argues that background beliefs and assumptions necessarily fill the gap. So just to take a toy example, if I come home and my vase of flowers is knocked on the floor, I might formulate the hypothesis that my cat knocked it off the shelf. But it's not the case that there's any necessary logical relationship between the observation that the vase of flowers is on the floor and the hypothesis, just in isolation. I need some background beliefs, like that I have a cat, that knocking things on the floor is something that cats do, that the law of gravity applies, and so on and so on. And some of these background beliefs might be more revisable than others. And so to return to the research context, what this means is that the kinds of decisions that you make to investigate a particular phenomenon or to interpret data you collect in all stages of research, from the initial question setting to collecting evidence to interpreting that data, there's always going to be background beliefs and assumptions that are necessarily guiding that research. And that's where epistemic and non-epistemic values come in. And so epistemic values might be things like simplicity or generalizability, or particularity and heterogeneity and complexity. These are all epistemic in that they're to do with knowledge, and non-epistemic, just sort of, let's say, social or political, let's say a value that you want to, that you believe in the equality of women or something like that. And so what Longino does is provide a formal or a philosophical argument for rejecting the idea that we can be objective in the traditional sense, that we can be value-free and aperspectival, so take this, not take the perspective of any particular individual. And she argues that scientific research is necessarily value-laden and will involve the researcher's own assumptions and background beliefs. So when it comes to collecting data, we're making a lot of value-laden choices and what data we collect and how we come to characterize it. And we might think this means we can't just read off the data we've collected and get to a particular inference or conclusion, but rather it's a process of value-laden interpretation that's always going to be pegged to our particular cognitive goals, so what we're trying to understand for what purpose, and also our wider social and political goals. And so there are ongoing debates in the philosophy of science about the relevance and the meaning of objectivity. Some people want to abandon it altogether, and some want to hold on to it, but in a very different form to these traditional conceptions of objectivity that I mentioned. Just briefly to say that for Longino, objectivity is something that arises out of the interactions, the social interactions of an epistemic community. Is not something that can be attributed to an individual or even an individual study. And for Sandra Harding, another philosopher, objectivity arises where we start research from the lives of the marginalized. And I just want to wrap up by mentioning this paper that came out last year from a Danish philosopher of science, Julia Zahler. And I bring this up not because I want to necessarily defend her particular account, or because I think it's the most significant thing that qualitative health researchers need to know, but just to give you an idea of the kind of philosophy of science that's going on that might be relevant to qualitative health research, and also how philosophy can actually often be really specific and grounded and even practical. So she suggests 6 objectivity-making features of qualitative data sets. So the background to this is that she thinks that objectivity is a worthwhile concept to hold on to for qualitative research because it acts as a stamp of epistemic praise. So it allows us to distinguish in some way between worthwhile and not worthwhile data sets, but traditional objectivity that's completely detached and aperspectival isn't possible or desirable for science in general, but qualitative research in particular. So she suggests we should be thinking about these lists of features as an alternative guiding ideal. And so she lays out descriptive adequacies, the idea that data will accurately describe what transpired when the researcher carried out participant observation or conducted interviews. Reactivity transparency, so the reactivity, if there is any, in the various situations described by field and interview data should be clear. Deception transparency, data should be supplemented with true deception assumptions about whether or not the research participants deceived the researcher, and if they did, how and why. Relevance, so it's relevant from the perspective of providing a satisfying answer to the research question under study. balance the data set as a whole, describe all the relevant types of people, activities, settings, viewpoints, events, and so on that are necessary to provide this satisfying answer to the research question, and sufficiency. So it's sufficient size-wise, it contains enough of these relevant types of data to provide the satisfying answer. And I would say this is philosophical in that she's thinking conceptually about the features of a qualitative data set. She's not going out and doing empirical work, but she's also offering really clear pragmatic suggestions that could potentially be taken up and implemented. So just to finish up, whether consciously and explicitly or not, researchers are necessarily making philosophical choices in the course of their research. And the underlying ontology or epistemology guides methodological decisions or is revealed by them. And it's important to reflect on these conceptual questions and think about how it might affect your research design, implementation, or interpretation. And I also just want to say that philosophers don't just work on these really deep fundamental questions. They often look at grounded proximate questions with immediate practical significance. So maybe it's worth looking at some of the recent philosophical literature and seeing what fruitful connections there might be. And this is just a list of readings. I can recommend this recent book by Sean Vyas on the philosophy of population health and public health, and then this book by this edited collection on the global epistemologies and philosophies of science, where they talk about the differences between Western and non-Western epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, and this kind of work, which is super interesting as well. Okay, great, thank you. And there's my Twitter and my email if anybody wants to get in touch.
I would like to say, Azita, that you've done half of my job, so thank you very much. So you've actually laid a very good foundation for me. And thank you everyone who is listening and who is attending this workshop. I hope that you get something out of it. I'm going to be focusing in my presentation on critical realism as a philosophy of science, which Azita already alluded to. And when I was saying that she's done half of my job is because she's already explicated what ontology is all about, epistemology and methodology. So I would not have to be explaining those terms at this point. I would just dive right in. So critical realism, I'm going to start off at the ontological level of critical realism. But because critical realism came, the philosophy of science related to critical realism only came after positivism and interpretivism had been more or less been established. I would like to start off with their perspective or their ontological stance before I now share the stance of critical realism, because these are the, I think I would say, I stand corrected, that these are the two most prominent philosophical stance that are still there, and critical realism is just gaining traction in recent years or decades. So in the positive and the ontological perspective of positivism relates to, according to positivists, the society shapes an individual, how an individual thinks. So there are social facts out there which exercise control over individuals. For example, when you have laws, when you have rules, these rules are meant to guide the way people behave. If you are in a school and this school have particular rules, the students are meant to follow the rules. So the school can be considered as a society. And so the rules that are all there, they govern and they guide the way these individuals think. And so also that people's action generally can be explained now based on the social norms. It can be explained using these social norms, using the rules. For example, you can actually count how many times people jump the red traffic light, because there are rules that people should not jump the red traffic lights. And then a quantitative based study or a study that is influenced by the positivist approach can be based on just counting how many times people break the rule of still driving over the red light. And then it also focuses on social structure. And when we talk about social structure, we're talking about the different cultures. You talk about the economy, you talk about the political situation, health systems. These are structures that have been established already in the past and continue to be shaped and be established as life moves on, but they are already existing. These are social structures. On the other side, which is interpretivism, it says that people are not necessarily governed by social laws or just follow laws that have been established, but they also have their own thoughts. They also have their own reasoning faculty, and they can also do things of their own volition and not really because they have been dictated by a particular rule. And so that they say that in that way, they say that people's experiences and their thought processes and their perspective of things should also be captured. And that is why, rather than focus on social structures like the economy and culture and other social structures that are out there, the qualitative or interpretivism focuses more on agency, which is about the person. And that's why we talk about worldview, what the person thinks about the world, and not just that there is a world out there that everybody experiences in a similar manner, but interpretivism suggests otherwise, that each individual understands and interprets the world around them differently based on their experiences. And so now let's move on to critical realism. Critical realism, its ontology now says that, but rather than saying that there is, on this left-hand side, there is a social structure that guides human behavior, and on the interpretivist side, it is guided by one's thinking and their conscience and their experiences. But critical realists say that, in fact, these two aspects guide how we look at the world, that there is an aspect that we act because of the social structure, because of the laws and things, but also these laws also have an impact on the way we think, on the way we reason, and on the way we interpret and experience life. And so they say that these two phenomena have a place in critical realism. They are both considered in the way we understand or how the world is and how it is. So critical realism therefore accepts that there are independent structures, there are the economic, political actors and political issues that are all there, but also there is also subjective knowledge, the person's way of looking at things, the person's understanding of life, the person's perspective also has a place and should be considered equally. So ontologically, critical realism looks at the world at three different strata. First, it is suggested that there is the real, the actual, and the empirical, where in the real, you have everything that is existing, you have the structures, you have mechanisms, and all these, they have the potential to generate a particular phenomenon or to generate a particular outcome or to cause a particular behavior. And then this is now the bigger sphere. But within that, they say that when these structures or mechanisms become activated in a particular context, then an event occurs. And when an event occurs, we are now in the actual sphere, where we have events that occur and events that do not occur. Sometimes they are not activated, therefore, and then events will not occur. And when they are activated, events occur. So the second sphere deals with the events and the non-events. Then now the empirical is now, which is the smallest of the sphere, is those events that can be observed, that can be measured, because some events can occur and we cannot measure them, we cannot actually experience them. But at the empirical level, we can only measure those phenomena and those events that actually take place, how people experience them, what happened. And apart from what happened, how did people experience it? And it is at this level that a realist evaluator, a realist researcher can obtain information regarding the real. So a realist researcher now, based on what they have been, based on information or evidence that they have been able to gather at the empirical level, they will now try to hypothesize or theorize of the essential structures and mechanisms that have to be in place for the observed outcomes that they have seen at the empirical level to occur. And then so now let's move to epistemology. So epistemology, therefore, is about uncovering those structures, uncovering those generative powers, uncovering the mechanisms that cause an event to take place. And so realist work in general is always about generative powers. It's always about mechanisms, because mechanisms are considered as the powers that actually generate an outcome or a particular behavior that is observed. And so the structures and the individuals, they now possess generative powers. The structures, like we're saying, the different laws, the different laws, the economy, the political sphere, they all have generative powers. And the individual also, through their thinking process, through their experiences, also possess these generative powers. And when these generative powers come together, it now determines how a person behaves, or which now also determines what is observed. What does that mean? That we cannot say that it's mainly because the economy is so bad, that is why people are stealing, or that is why there is an increase in robbery, because COVID-19 came and then people have lost their jobs, and then that is why there is an increase in theft or crime. On the other hand, we have to say it's not only that, but what is it about the person or the people who are committing the crime? What is it about them? What is it about their thought processes that have made them also to be perpetrating or to change their behavior pattern? And so these two generative powers need to come together for a particular behavior to be explained. So that's the epistemology of criticalism. And so mechanism now is very big, and structures, how exactly did the behavior come about, is what mechanism is all about. So mechanisms are these underlying entities, the processes and the structures that are in place or that are causing us to observe a particular outcome of interest. So in realist evaluation, they are actually looked as the reasoning and the response that participants attribute to particular structures or particular social events, or even their own opportunities and constraints that they see as they move along. And so social structures directly or indirectly influence a person's thinking. So that is where you now have the social structure and the individual coming together, and the agency coming together to explain how an event occurs. And so context becomes very critical in realist evaluation, because we say that the context within which that person is influences whether or not they behave in a particular way. So again, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into what mechanisms are, and because they are very central in realist explication or explaining things in realist work. So they usually have the following characteristics. They are hidden. So it's not like you say that I saw the mechanism. Mechanisms cannot see. It's like part of somebody's reasoning. You cannot see the person's reasoning, but through the effects that they cause, we can actually hypothesize their presence. We can actually theorize their existence. They are sensitive to variation in context. And somebody will behave differently in a particular context and behave differently in a different context, but he's the same person who thinks in a particular way. And then obviously, according to realist researchers, mechanisms generate outcomes. So in terms of the methodology now, which is where I'm coming to now, the qualitative research, qualitative methods are very critical in how we obtain mechanisms and how we actually identify these mechanisms, and how we actually postulate or theorize how they have caused the outcome. So if you want to know, for example, why people are not taking their antiretroviral treatment, for example, you cannot just say it's because the medication is not available, but there are other things about the person, there are other things about their family that make them to behave in a particular way. There are other things about their lives in general, their workplace, there are other aspects about their lives that would make them to behave in a particular way. There are also structures like stigma that is out there. There are also discrimination. There is also jealousy. There are a lot of things that have to come into place for the person to behave in a particular way. And so qualitative methods, we find them very critical, therefore, in uncovering these mechanisms and also identifying the critical contextual context within which this mechanism becomes triggered and what outcome that they bring about. So before we move to that, we would just want to see how realism talks about causality, because we keep talking about outcomes and a particular behavior. And so this is a diagram that tries to explicate how an event or an effect is observed. So we say that the structures have the causal powers, and we've already spoken about that, which is like your laws, the economy, culture, and then we now have the mechanism which is in the middle, which is what actually causes the outcome that is observed. And then we also have other conditions, which is also labeled context, which also comes with it also have generative powers, or also comes with other mechanisms that when all these elements combine together can lead to the effect that is seen. I'm going to explain this one with an example very shortly. So for example, in one study that I was doing to understand why adolescents are struggling to adhere to the antiretroviral treatment, we decided to theorize, because in other qualitative work, we'll just see factors affecting adherence to medication amongst adolescents, and that is what is very prevalent out there. But we now say that we shouldn't just end at identifying such factors, but can we go deeper to identify those critical mechanisms that cause them not to adhere to their medication? Can we be able to theorize at a deeper level, identify those critical structures out there and the thinking processes, the perspectives and understanding of these adolescents, so that we can be able to theorize how what happens and why they are not adhering to their medication. And so we decided to use the photo voice methodology. And our reason for choosing the photo voice methodology was just to be able to encourage them to be able to speak, because we thought that standard interview and focus group approaches would have been a little bit difficult for them to be able to express themselves. And so we asked them to go and take pictures of their experiences, of their environment, of anything that represents their journey on antiretroviral treatment. And so using the pictures that they brought back to us, we interrogated them or interviewed them and had focus group discussions with them. And through that, we could identify the mechanisms, the context, and the outcome that. So before we did that, this is how we postulated possible outcomes. We used the causality diagram that I've just shared, and we said possible structures before we went in with gender, family structure, and then possible mechanisms, perceived social support. And I'm going to go deeper. So this is an example of a code that one of the adolescents shared with us. And the O that you see there would be an outcome, the C would be context, and the M is mechanism. And so this is what the adolescent was saying, and this is the picture that they projected. And they said, this picture is like how I felt last month. I felt down, like depressed, like tired to commit suicide. I tried to commit suicide. So that was an outcome. And that is how they are feeling. So like I drank my grandmother's pills. I did it 4 times. This photo is like explaining exactly how I felt. Down, don't want to leave anymore. I had my status since I was a baby, and I only realized it when I was 10 years old. So that was the context. The context is them getting to know their HIV status only later in life. And so my grandmother told me, and I was like, okay, but it's starting to get to me now. And so that is the mechanism, that is what is going through their head, that is what they are perceiving of their situation. So in as much as they have been on treatment for a long time, she was 16 by the time we did this interview, this focus group discussion, but she's starting to feel a certain way at the age of 16, where she doesn't want to take her medication, antiretroviral medication anymore. She now blames her parents for what is going on. And that is what we see. So using that, we could construct a program theory, we would call it in realist term, and we still follow the same causality pattern that we used. I also did another qualitative research using the critical realist approach. And this one was to understand how differentiated care models increase men's engagement on antiretroviral care, and still following that approach. This is on the left-hand side are the different things that differentiated care models offer: quick, flexible section, available medication when they arrive, there is information sharing, and there is conducive environment for them. And the critical mechanisms that we identified here were perceived usefulness. So what they shared is that they perceived that the model that they were in was very useful, and they had a sense of assurance, and they also felt like a sense of cohesion. As you know, men, they're doing manly things together, and that cohesion, when they come together, helped them to support one another. And so we hypothesized or theorized that this helped them to reformulate their masculinity and their way of looking at antiretroviral treatment, which improved their understanding. So one of the things that I need to share with you in the theorizing process in critical realism, it's called retroduction. And the reason why we say it's retroduction is because, so now I have to go back to our ontology, is because you are moving from what you have observed at the empirical level, and you're moving backwards to identify the things that are happening at the real. So you're moving from the empirical to the real. So information that is gathered from the empirical level is now used to theorize what is existing at the real that is causing the particular phenomenon that is observed. Thank you very much for listening.